We are in Sefer Vayikra, and what is the dominant theme of Sefer Vayikra?
Korbanot.
The Korbanot, yes, the sacrifices. Right? It's called Leviticus. Why is it called Leviticus?
Because the sacrifices are done by the Levites.
Okay, well, by the Kohanim who come from
Kohanim.
Levi. Yeah. Okay, good. So, so we're focused now primarily. There's lots of other stuff, but if we had to give a major theme to Sefer Vayikra, certainly the first half it would be the Korbanot, the sacrifices. Major transition point is Parshat Kedoshim, where we have what academics call the holiness code, and then it concludes with the Tochacha. But the major theme is certainly the Korbanot and the functioning of the Mishkan. Now that the Mishkan has been built, we now learn about what takes place in there on a regular basis. And the sacrifices obviously are, I want to say challenging, but it's nothing we're used to. And so one challenge of the sacrifices is to think about what the Mishkan, what the Beis HaMikdash was really like. And when we talk about Mashiach coming and wanting the Beis HaMikdash to come back, what is it that we're yearning for? And how, it's not something, it's a very different way of practicing and thinking than we're perhaps accustomed to. And then there's the question about, the sacrifices in general, big gadol, bird's eye view, what's the purpose? Why this whole system of sacrifices and what's it meant to do? Then of course, each one of the sacrifices on their own has to be delved into and understood. What the symbolism is, what it's meant to represent, when it's offered, all sorts of interesting details. And I'm sure over the course of Sefer Vayikra, we'll get into some of that. For tonight, we want to stay kind of overview. We're going to look at a very famous debate between the Rambam and the Ramban, Maimonides and Nachmanides, over the nature and the purpose of these sacrifices that we're going to be involved with for the next several months. Okay? That's kind of our roadmap for tonight. So we're going to begin with the Rambam, with Maimonides in the Guide to the Perplexed. And he has a very, very, very interesting theory, explanation of the sacrifices and why we have them. So he writes as follows. It is impossible to go suddenly from one extreme to the other. It is therefore, according to the nature of man, impossible for him to suddenly discontinue everything to which he has been accustomed. The Israelites were commanded to devote themselves to his service. But the custom which was in those days, general among all men, in the general mode of worship in which the Israelites were brought up, consisted in sacrificing animals in those temples which contained certain images, to bow down to those images and to burn incense before them. It was in accordance with the wisdom and plan of God as displayed in the whole creation. He did not command us to give up and to discontinue all these manners of service. For to obey such a commandment, it would have been contrary to the nature of man, who generally cleaves to that to which he is used. It would in those days have made the same impression as a prophet would make at present. He called us to the service of God and told us in his name that we should not pray to him, not fast, not seek his help in time of trouble, that we should serve him in thought and not by any action. For this reason, God allowed these kinds of service to continue. He transferred to his service that which had formerly served as worship of created beings, of things imaginary and unreal, and commanded us to serve him in the same manner. By this divine plan, the traces of idolatry were blotted out, and the truly great principle of our faith, the existence and unity of God, was firmly established. This aim was achieved without deterring or confusing the minds of the people by the abolition of the services to which they were accustomed, and which alone was familiar to them. What's he saying?
Sounds like he's apologizing for God.
He's apologizing for God. That's an interesting way of framing it. Say a little bit more, Gary.
He says this is really not the right thing, but what could God do given the nature he gave us?
So is he apologizing for God or for humans?
Considering, well, what's the difference?
Well,
We are the way he made us.
okay. So Gary says that Rambam here is apologizing for God, that God made us in a way that was inferior and therefore had to accommodate us. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
Anyone?
doesn't that have to do with God having given us free will? If he want, if free will implies doesn't free will apply acceptance of imperfection?
It certainly does. So that's an interesting question, right? When in the course of history, right, did humans get it wrong? To be so, right? Was this the nature of man from the beginning? In which case, maybe he is apologizing for God. Or was this something that humans messed up at some point in history? And as Jeff says, God gave us free will. And so if through our free will, we came to improper religious thoughts and practices, maybe it's not necessarily God's fault. That's an interesting, two very interesting ways of framing this. And two very interesting and important philosophical points to keep in mind.
Well,
Anyone else?
I'm criticizing Rambam, not God.
Say that again.
Bear in mind, this is a criticism of Rambam, not
Okay.
of God.
Okay. So fair enough. Okay. So, but we can both agree that what he's describing is that humans at an early point in history got it wrong as far as what is proper religious worship. And therefore, when God wanted to set us on the right path, it couldn't be a sharp 90-degree or 180 U-turn. It had to be a more gradual turn. And so God is trying to wean us off of these improper religious practices by giving us mitzvot and ways of approaching God that are in the framework of that which we were accustomed to. Yeah.
It's a way that people could view the Akeda too, that Hashem is always trying to tell us, well, what you may think the culture is telling you to do is not really what I want you to do. And if you can wean yourself off of sacrifices, so much the better, that kind of idea.
Okay. It might even be more powerful than that, because certainly when it comes to the Akeda, which is a very stark example, it's clear that in ultimately telling Abraham not to sacrifice Yitzchak, that it was a clear and direct criticism of what others were doing. Mm-hmm. So it was an intentional rejection of that. Okay.
Some people might say that substituting animals for human beings, a cow, a sheep, a goat, or whatever, instead of offering up a human being as a valuable offering to indicate how important the relationship is. God is being very direct with in the Torah that no human sacrifice is permitted. The Akedat Yitzhak is an object lesson where somebody might think yes, right. Goes to the point and is stopped.
Right.
And
for sure.
So, but that implies then that maybe the entire sacrificial structure, the offering structure of sharing a meal with God, so to speak, that's kind of training wheels for the religious relationship. And at a certain point, the training wheels may not be needed, may be removed, and the relationship would be acted out without that kind of physical offering that might be kind of a holdover from an earlier stage of development of
Right.
people and ideas.
Okay, beautiful. So let's continue. Let's see the rest of this. I think we got the basic idea. I know that you will at first thought, sorry, let me just make sure it's displayed on your screen. Reject this idea and find it strange. You will put the following question to me in your heart. How can we suppose that divine commandments, prohibitions, and important acts, which are fully explained and for which certain seasons are fixed, should not have been commanded for their own sake, but only for the sake of some other thing, as if they were only the means which he employed for his primary objects? What prevented him from making his primary object a direct commandment to us, to give us the capacity of obeying it? What's the question he's addressing here?
Nice question, yeah.
Right. So why should we need this? Why should we need to be steered away from the improper action? Right? Shouldn't God give us mitzvot that speak on their own terms? So he answers, it is contrary to man's nature that he should suddenly abandon all the different kinds of divine service and the different customs in which he has been brought up, which have been so general that they were considered a matter of course. It would be just as if a person trained to work as a slave with mortar and bricks or similar things should interrupt his work, clean his hands, and at once fight with real giants. It was the result of God's wisdom that the Israelites were led in the wilderness till they acquired courage. It is a well-known fact that the rough conditions of desert travel produce tough fighters. In the same way, the sacrificial portion of the Torah was promoted by divine wisdom, according to which people are allowed to continue the kind of worship to which they are accustomed, in order that they may acquire true faith, which is the chief object of God's commandments. Okay, so God couldn't have just, given us the directive to change course on a dime, because that's contrary to human nature. God had to take into his consideration how humans would react and how would we assimilate and internalize the ultimate message that he's trying to give us, and the ultimate direction that he's trying to steer us on. It had to be a gradual thing. So therefore, we are given this directive for sacrifices in order to not make religious worship, religious action, service of God, something that is completely foreign and inaccessible to us at that point in history. Right? This is not the only time where the Rambam has such a similar thought about general developments of human nature and where we fit in, right? He alludes to it in the first paragraph. It says it would be as if a prophet comes and says, God doesn't really want you to do any of these mitzvot. God doesn't really want you to do any of these services. He just wants you to meditate all day. Rambam, in fact, thinks that's what the ultimate is that we should spend our time meditating and thinking about the metaphysics and the nature of God. But we are, we're not, most of us are not at that level. And so therefore we need the mitzvot to help get us to that point. That's what Torah study should be ultimately directed to. So it's a common theme within Rambam that we have these kind of arching developments. So it's similar also to his explanation of tefillah, of prayer, where that's kind of the opposite, where we go to a more structured because of the downfall of each generation. But it's a common pattern that we find in his thought. And so he says that these sacrifices were given as a way to accommodate man's nature and understanding as we were at the time of the giving of these mitzvot. Interesting to think if Hashem were to appear to us, start this whole process today, with technology and the rest of world's history where it is, what would the language be and what would the starting point be to get us to where we ultimately need to go? But certainly, as the Rambam understands it, for the Jews living, having just experienced Yetziat Mitzrayim, this was the proper course of action in order that they would find their way in the path to proper worship of Hashem. Any more questions on this first source?
Not really, but it sounds as if the end point of Rambam's Judaism is Buddhism.
How so?
Well, because the contemplation of the nature of God and the lack of activity of actively doing mitzvot, but rather to basically do no harm and just meditate on the nature of God. That sounds pretty Buddhist to me.
Yeah, put away the multiple idols and all that, but yes.
Somebody, I forget who, was at Shul a few months back carrying a copy of Spinoza's Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, and I raised my hand, and he said that Rambam was sort of the logical predecessor to Spinoza, which I said was way over my pay grade.
Right. Interesting. Okay, so let's okay, so we can skip number 10. Yeah, let's go to source number 3. So basis for the Rambam is found, in some of the classical sources. At least in this one medrash, we find Rabbi Pinchas b'shem Rabbi Levi Omer. Mashal, he's explaining what the sacrifices are all about. Mashal ben Melech shegas libo alav vayalamelech o basar nevelo to trefot. He says that these the sacrifices are analogous to a prince, a king's son, who becomes haughty and rejects the king's tradition, rejects Judaism, and starts eating unkosher food. Amar HaMelech, Zeh yetadir al shulchani umeyatzmohu gador. So the king says, I see my son has gone astray, but it's better that he continue to eat at my table, and through this he'll become he'll get back on the right path. He'll become disciplined. Kach lefi shayu Yisrael lehutim achar avodat kochavim b'Mitzrayim, vayu mevi'im korbanehem lasi'irim. So similarly, just as the Jews were attached to idolatry while they were in Egypt, they would bring their sacrifices to goats. As it says, right, they should no longer offer their sacrifices to goats. And these goats represent shadim, which is, demons or some other sort of false god, false deity. As it says, they sacrifice to shadim, to demons. And right, A equals B, B equals C. So if the goats equals the shade and the shade equals the goat, so therefore it was one and the same. They would offer sacrifices at bamot, at individual altars, and they would get punished. So God says they should, at the very least, if they're going to offer these improper sacrifices, at the very least, they should offer it in the Ohel Moed, in the tent of meeting. Eventually, they'll separate themselves from the idolatrous components of the sacrifices, and they'll be saved. As it says, every person from the children of Israel when they bring their sacrifices. Okay, so according to this medrash, the point of the sacrifices is that it was a way of not totally rejecting, not totally throwing them out, out of the conversation, out of the tradition, but as a way to keep them engaged, and with the hope that ultimately they would be led back to be led to proper service. Yeah, it's a very powerful medrash also in the context of thinking about, we've become accustomed in some circles, right? If a child is, quote, off the derech, leaves the fold or leaves the religious practices, right? What's the typical, or what's the one very common reaction to this?
To shun them the way the Amish do.
Yeah, to shun them, right? We hear of parents sitting shiva for children, whether it's at a point of intermarriage or some other point where a child is clearly no longer connected to Jewish practice. So this medrash is saying that might not be the best approach, right? And in fact, it might be if we're supposed to follow in God's ways. So this, rejecting and shunning children who are off the derech might in fact be the opposite of following in God's ways, because God made accommodations for Bnei Israel who were immersed in idolatry. So quite an interesting medrash, which gives us a lot of food for thought. But in any case, the Abarbanel in source number 4 quotes this medrash word for word. We don't need to read the entire thing, but at the very end, he says, "Hamamar hazeh moreh bebiur shaya da'atam zal binyan hakorbanot kedat harav hamoreh." So this medrash teaches that the rabbis were of the same opinion, of the same approach, same understanding of sacrifices as the Rambam was. Okay, just
Well,
as the
how does anyone except Rabbi Pinchas and Rabbi Levi were of that opinion?
Okay, so it's correct. In the Medrash, there certainly are other opinions that don't necessarily agree with Rabbi Levi, but right. So he shows whether he says all of Chazal, this is the dominant position in Chazal, or at least it's a legitimate position within Chazal. Right? We've already intimated what some of the difficulties with the Rambam might be. So he says, well, this certainly supports the Rambam, and the fact that it is part of the canon, the main part of the Medrash, might indicate in his understanding that this is the normative position, this is the mainstream, and that this, if we were to pin, if it's possible to pin what is the opinion of the rabbis, the Abarbanel seems to be saying this is it. But you're right, the Medrash brings multiple opinions and has lots of different back and give and take. But at the very least, for the Abarbanel, it is a legitimate approach.
Right, but to me, it's definitely less than a proof.
Okay. So we don't have to take this as an absolute proof, but but certainly we have precedent for the Rambam in earlier sources, and it's not, he's not a das yachid in this understanding of the korbanot, of the sacrifices. Very interesting. I didn't really think about this until it was pointed out. But when we think about the Mishkan, the Beit HaMikdash, one of the common places that we think of is the long poem song that Shlomo HaMelech declares after the dedication of the Beit HaMikdash, Malachim Aleph. So we have a long section here. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but display the English. And we'll just read some of the verses here. No, I'll just stay in the English to be on the same page with everyone. Now, therefore, O God of Israel, let the promise that you made to your servant, my father David, be fulfilled. But will God really dwell on earth? Even the heavens and their uttermost reaches cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? Right. So this harks back to last week's shiur, and God's glory filling the house. Can a physical space contain God, and what does that mean? Yet turn, O Lord my God, to the prayer and supplication of your servants, and hear the cry and prayer which your servant offers before you this day. May your eyes be open day and night towards this house, towards the place of which you have said, my name shall abide there. May you heed the prayers which your servants will offer toward this place. When you hear the supplication which your servant and your people Israel offer towards this place, give heed in your heavenly abode, give heed in pardon. Whenever one man commits an offense against another, the latter utters an imprecation to bring a curse upon him, and comes with his imprecation before your altar in this house, O hear in heaven and take action to judge your servants, condemning him who is in the wrong and bringing down the punishment of his conduct on his head, vindicating him who is in the right by rewarding him according to his righteousness. What, according to Shlomo, is going to happen in this Beis HaMikdash that he has just dedicated?
Prayer.
Sounds like somehow justice is going to be done.
Justice, it's a place
Yeah.
of justice.
How that's going to work.
What does he not mention?
Sacrifice.
He doesn't mention sacrifice. Right? It's very interesting, right? So we've seen some of the insights of Rabbi Shmuley Phillips and other shiurim, but he pointed this out in a footnote. I hadn't really thought about it. And just kind of take for granted that, of course, the Beis HaMikdash is a place of sacrifices, but he says it's significant that in the lengthy, eloquent dedication speech for the first Beit HaMikdash, the concept of sacrifice and korban does not receive even a single mention. Instead, King Shlomo, the wisest of all men, tackles the philosophical difficulties which arise from the notion of a metaphysical God dwelling in a specific place, and asks God to accept all of the heartfelt prayers which all nations would direct toward him via the Mikdash. Okay?
According to Solomon, what was supposed to happen in his temple that was not already happening in Shiloh? I mean, I don't understand the transition he's talking about.
Well, maybe activity-wise, there was no difference.
You're
But
going from a temporary to a permanent
But you're
structure.
going from a temporary to permanent. You're going from a tent
And
in the
I-
backyard to a properly standing building.
Right. But if justice going to come out now we have a permanent building, and justice was lacking in a temporary building, I don't understand this at all.
Well, I'm not sure he's saying justice was lacking in the Mishkan, but that this, as I dedicate this synagogue, this building, this place, it will be a place of justice.
But he's talking about a lot of exceptional things. I mean, famines, war,
Mhm.
people who really hate somebody, really, the imprecation, they're hating, they're coming, they're cursing, and,
Right.
how to deal with things like that. He's not talking about the, I would call the challenge of teshuvah, of constantly, day by day, trying to make changes by submitting part of oneself to Hashem, by offering, in some sense, our energies and to come closer to Hashem. He's not talking about that process. And after this, he winds up slaughtering more cattle than anybody
Right.
else for a very long time. I mean, a lot of sacrifice that's going to go on.
Right.
But it's like he's trying to make the case that, okay, look, even in the worst circumstances, this is the place to come for prayer.
Mhm.
This is what we're going to do.
Exactly.
That kind of a case.
Right.
Right. So, Gary, I'm not, I'm not sure that he's saying it's functionally any different or than what took place in the Mishkan. But, I think it's, if the Mishkan was from its inception only a temporary dwelling place with the understanding that there would be a permanent place eventually built. So now we've built that permanent place, and that's something to celebrate. Anyway,
If I could suggest it's the permanent Beit HaMikdash is solid at a specific point, an elevated point that is visible from distances, and it's a focus. Unlike the Mishkan, which theoretically could be a moving target, literally, if you want to go there to pray and you don't know what the schedule is, or you forgot the schedule, it might end up being in Beersheba on one day. Theoretically, it could be in Shomron and another day, and so on. It's hard to find, it's hard to focus. This is one place, it is there, it's waiting for people to come, to give attention, to think, to interact emotionally, intellectually, at that one particular place, which is the connection point, the nexus point between the divine and the human.
yeah.
And also, too, it's a physically beautiful, imposing splendorous building, and it's just being there would be elevating to the spirit, as opposed to a place like Shiloh, which was just bama, high place, an altar.
Yeah. Okay, so again, the point of bringing this was to show that despite the Torah's emphasis on the sacrifices, at least in this, and Anne's correct, the dedication of the Beis Hamikdash certainly included a lot of animal sacrifices. And we read about that, but in Shlomo's description of it, there is no mention of the sacrifices. So despite what we would have thought from reading Sefer Vayikra, there seems to be some basis for the Rambam's position that maybe the sacrifices are not the end goal here, not the proper focus.
Isn't it Yirmiyahu who says God says I despise your sacrifices?
Every prophet says something along those lines, but yes, yeah. Including Yirmiyahu. Yes, so there's there's a separate question of sacrifices without proper accompanying action and intention. But as far as the role of the sacrifices, we might have another support for that. The idea that the sacrifices are not the ikar, not the essence, or should not be the focus or the end goal. With that in mind, we do need to contend. I just have one example here, but the Rambam, it's not so clear though what his ultimate position is, because in Hilchot Melachim, the laws of kings, which describes what's going to happen when Mashiach comes, the Rambam writes as follows: HaMelech HaMashiach atid la'amod u'lahachazir malchut David leyoshna memshalah harishona. So Mashiach is going to restore the Davidic reign and the rule of the house of David. Uboneh HaMikdash mikabetz nidchei Yisrael. He will build the temple and gather the exiles, the exiles of Israel. V'chozrin kol hamishpatim b'yamav kishayu mikodem. All laws will be returned, will resort to how they were previously. Makrivin korbanot v'osin shmitin v'yovlot kechol mitzvotan hamura b'Torah. They will offer sacrifices and set shmita and yovel years, as all the mitzvot said in the Torah. Anyone who does not believe and wait impatiently for Mashiach to come, not only rejects the words of the prophets, but rejects the words of the Torah of Moshe himself, etc., etc. Okay, so he says here that there will be sacrifices when the days of Mashiach, which seems to go counter to what he had written in the Moreh Nevuchim. Because in the Moreh Nevuchim he writes that sacrifices were a temporary stopgap, stop measure for those who are not properly religiously trained. But we know when Mashiach comes, it's going to be Mala Kol Haaretz Yedei Hashem. The entire land will be filled with knowledge of God, right? There will be no improper religious thought. So why the need for the sacrifices if they're only meant to wean us off of those, bad influences from the time in which the Torah was originally given?
Well, there are two different audiences for these two different writings. The audience for the Moreh Nevuchim were a group that were following along with the culture around them of poetry and philosophical inquiry and
that's interesting, because generally the Moreh Nevuchim is generally understood to be the book directed, the more elite book, right? The book directed to those who had proper philosophical understanding, and the Mishnah Torah is more of the for the common folk. So you're saying the opposite, that maybe the Moreh Nevuchim.
I'm talking about differences between generations. He was writing to young people in the Moreh Nevuchim who were enchanted to a great an extent with that kind of culture.
Okay, interesting.
That's what I'm saying, and that the Mishnah Torah was, once you've come on full throttle to your acceptance of being a Jew and realizing you have to differentiate yourself and can't go too far in one direction or the other, this is a way you can do it, that kind of thing. That's what I
Okay,
mean.
interesting.
In fact, there
So
is.
so just walk me through the next step. So why does the Mishnah Torah call for sacrifices in days of Mashiach?
Because even the Rambam's seeming requirement to do some meditation, I think, has been understood by some to mean that in the case, at least, of the sin offerings and the guilt offerings, that one is realizing that in fact the separation that Averas cause from our unity with Hashem, to change those patterns, people need to be jolted into the realization that what's happening to the animal could have happened to them, but hasn't, out of God's mercy, and that they will. So but unless one understands it that way, or there's a meditation of some sort like that, the word meditation is actually used in some sources, that they should be thinking about what's going on there. It should be disturbing to them in order to make changes in their behavior. On the other hand, we have the Ola offering, which is given all of the time, and the Tamid offering, which is a type of that, which shows that we are to fully to give ourselves to Hashem as much as we can from an animal perspective. But there's another perspective here. It raises questions. It's meant to be somewhat disturbing, I think.
Interesting.
So
Interesting.
that it's an acknowledgement that human beings in many ways are like animals, and that's not going to change in the days of Mashiach. Our capacity to have the knowledge that we need, whatever that means, will be increased. And
So everyone, let's hold on to Anne's thought, and after we read the Ramban, come back but I want to hear if anyone has any other thoughts on the Rambam first.
One other thing is, well, at the time that the Rambam is forecasting, there'll still be a lot of Gentiles in the world who will certainly acknowledge the God of Israel, but probably need something a little more concrete than to show it than Jews who are at the level of the Rambam might need. So
so you're saying there might be an initial step. Interesting. So the sacrifices you're saying might be for the non-Jews, or we could add to that maybe non-observant, non-practicing Jews in the time of Mashiach, who had their moment of revelation, just like the Jews in Egypt, accepted God, but now they need to go on their journey to get to the proper place. And so it's keeping this sort of concession to those who are just beginning on the path. Is that a fair assessment of what you said?
Yes.
Okay, very, very interesting thought. Very interesting thought. Any other ideas on this? So there are those who say that when the Rambam says that there's going to be sacrifices, when Mashiach comes, he's referring only to those sacrifices which are expressions of gratitude to God. Yeah, the purely, the Korban Ola, the Korban Tamid, the ones that are, won't necessarily be practiced anymore because we'll have moved beyond that, but that those sacrifices that express a feeling of gratitude or other basic emotions might still be in play. There's lots of other ways that people address this, but those are a couple of them. But those are some. We had some really interesting suggestions as well.
Not quite, because there's still, the way I read Rambam, there would still be guilt offerings on Yom Tovim.
Right. What he would do with those, I'm not sure. I don't have a great answer either, but I did just want to point out that it's not so cut and dry, even within the Rambam. So there's a lot more work to be done. But let's see the position of the Ramban. Amar harav nevuchim ki atam korbanot ba'avor shemitzrim va'kastim asher hayu Yisrael garim v'toshvim ba'artzam ve'olam hayu ovdim labakar v'latzon. Right, so he summarizes the Rambam, who says that the reason for the sacrifices is because the Egyptians and the Khazadians who lived in the time of the redemption from Egypt, when Jews lived in their lands, they would worship cattle and sheep. Piamitzrim of dim latale v'hakasdim of dim lashedim asher yulahem b'demut seirim anshe hodu adayom lo yishchatu bakar le'olam. Okay, etc., etc. Let's skip down a couple lines. כדי שיוודע כי הדבר שחושבים כהם בתכלית העבירה הוא אשר יקריבו לבוראו ובו יתכפרו העוונות. Says the very thing with which these other nations were sinning would be offered to God as a way of atonement and to appease for the sins that they had committed. כן יתרפו האמונות והרעות שהם מדווי הנפש. This is the way to appear to heal and cure afflictions of the soul. כי כל מדווה וכל חולי לא יתרפק אם בהפכו. Right? Any illness or wrong thought is only healed by doing the exact opposite. ובהם העריך והנה הם דברי הבאי. So the Rambam goes to great length explaining this, right? So if the cows and the sheep were worshipped, so no, God says you should slaughter them and show that they're totally submissive, and that's how they would overcome these improper idolatrous thought. The Ramban says, "Hein divrei havai." These are words of futility. Yirpu shever gadol v'kushya rabba al miklei yasu shulchan Hashem migoel migual shenenu rak lotzi miliban shoshaim v'tipshei olam. Right, and to say that the point of the sacrifices is only to remove improper thoughts from people who are foolish and uneducated. Katuv amar ki hem lechem ishei l'reach nichoach. The Torah itself says that the sacrifices are lechem isheh, a fire of bread, the reach nichoach, for pleasant smell, v'gam ki lefi shitutam shel Mitzrayim lo titrapeh machalatam bazeh. Right, and even right, this, forgetting the fact that the Torah says that there's for some elevated purpose that we're doing this. It's for food, it's for pleasant smell. But even right in the Egyptian mindset, sacrificing a sheep won't cure them, won't remove the improper thoughts from them, from their heads. Aval tosif mach'o, it's just going to make them more pained. Ki machshevet harashaim hanizkarim la'avod mazal ta'aleh, mazal shor, sheyesh lahem koach bahem כפי מחשבתם, לכן לא יאכלו אותם בכבוד כוחם ויסודם. ואם יזבחו אותם לשם הנכבד, זה כבוד להם ומעלהם, ועצמם כך הם נוהגים. Right? So the Egyptians will just say, the fact that the Jews are now sacrificing the animal that we worshipped shows that they see it also as being really of the most elevated, the most important animal. That's why they're offering it to their God. So it's not even going to remove the improper religious thoughts from the foreigners, from the idolaters. I just want to skip a couple lines. So Rambam also writes that these foreign nations would offer sacrifices to the moon on Rosh Chodesh, when the moon is at the new moon, and to the sun when whatever zodiacs or constellations were seen. Right, and so he said, so the Rambam is of the opinion that the improper thoughts will be cured when we eat these animals. Shehu asur lahem, which is forbidden to those who worship the animals. Right, and they would never do such a thing. Now the Ramban raises another objection. Hine Noach b'tzeitu min hateva im shloshet banav ein ba'olam kasti o mitzri. When Noach leaves the ark with his 3 sons, there was no one else left in the world. There was no Chaldean, there was no Egyptian. He kriv korban vayitav b'nei Hashem. And what did Noach do? He offered a sacrifice, and it was good in the eyes of God. V'amar vayarach Hashem et reach hanichalach. Umimenu amar elibo lo sifo lekalel et adam haba bor adam. It says that God smells the good smell of the sacrifice, and then God commits to never again destroy the world. Hevel hivigam humi b'charot sono umechavehen. And Hevel brought the best of his sheep and their fats. Vayosha Hashem el Hevel v'minchato. And God turned and accepted Hevel and his offering. Lo haya adayin ba'olam shemetz avodah zara klal. There was not even a trace of idolatry in the world at that point. U'bilam amar chivat hamizbachot acharti arachti va'al par va'ayo b'mizbeach. And when Bilam is trying to he's trying to curse the Jewish people, but he thinks he's doing it by beseeching God. And he says that he built altars and he offers sacrifices. He offers cows. His intention was not to somehow reject idolatrous thoughts or notions, but his intention in building these these altars was to come close to God. In order that God will communicate with him. Lashon korbanot et korbani lachmi lisherech nichalach chalila shelo yeh behem shum toelet v'ratzon rak sholelut avodah zara. Right, and again he says that when God introduces the sacrifices, it says korbani lachmi, my sacrifice, my bread, my meal, reach nichalchi, pleasant smell. God forbid that we should think that the only purpose is to negate improper thoughts. Okay, so the Ramban comes out very strongly against the Rambam. And it's interesting, right? Before that, and any initial thoughts or questions on what the Ramban writes? So it's interesting what Anne was saying before in trying to justify or explain the Rambam's inclusion of of sacrifices when Mashiach comes. She kind of was going on the same explanation of the Ramban and attributing it to the Rambam. So I'm not sure the Ramban would necessarily agree with your explanation or justification, other than to say maybe in Mashiach the Rambam will get it right? Because he's pretty harsh in his critique of the Rambam. But he raises a pretty strong argument counter to the Rambam's position. Who do we think is correct? Do we think it's the Rambam or the Ramban?
I think they're both right in some regards.
Okay. Well, that has to be the answer, right? somehow we're gonna find a compromise. But how do you think they're both right?
Neither of them is going to do away altogether with the practice or the concept of a korban.
Mm-hmm.
And whether they are emphasizing one aspect or another of what we are reading in right now in Vayikra, they understand it as a korban, coming close to Hashem. Both of them do that. There's no question about that. The question is what to do, really, in a sense, with the animals. How is one supposed to approach this difference or similarity to the cultures around one? It's true that the Egyptians didn't eat a whole lot of meat because a lot of their deities were connected with that, but they still did. It's clear from a lot of archaeology that they still did. But it was the Canaanites who were the ones who were doing a lot of active animal sacrifice, and that's been left out of the picture. The Canaanites are not Chaldeans, they are not Egyptians, but in Haaretz there was a lot of it. I've read the Ugaritic text. Right. I mean, good grief, it is very different from what was in Egypt or what was in Babylon. I don't know, just from my perspective, there's well, everybody works with a limited amount of knowledge,
Yeah.
certainly myself
Okay.
included. But uh, they both clearly have the concept of a korban, and they both want to bring us as close to Hashem as they can. And the pleasing odor aspect of it, some have just simply taken that as really the most important part, which means that when we do Hashem's will, Hashem is delighted with it. And this is the only mitzvah that we have that it says Hashem finds this as pleasing. It doesn't have to be pleasing odor, but really pleasing.
Right.
Why? Because it is a direct challenge to our wills to do it. And when we do it, it is very pleasing to Hashem, because Hashem realizes that this is His will and that we don't understand it, and it's hard for us to do, and therefore it's a good thing. So I don't know, maybe both of them address that in some other way in their
Okay,
works. I
okay,
haven't seen
good.
it, but I think that's a very important point, and the concept of a korban also.
Okay, beautiful. So we're quickly coming to the end of our hour, and so I think we're going to stop here. I mean, with the sources. If there's any other thoughts or questions, I'm happy to take anything else. But again, these two giants of our tradition have, at the surface, what seems to be exact opposite approaches to understanding what we're going to be spending the next couple of months focused on in every Shabbos morning as we read the Torah and read about the different sacrifices, the korbanot, and the circumstances and how they were done and all that. So this is a fundamental debate that we should be thinking about, and I hope that as we make our way through Vayikra, these two different ways of thinking and approaching it will frame our thoughts. I'm sure that we'll come back to this, right? And in many ways, it's reminiscent of the machlokas between the Ramban and Rashi about the Mishkan, right? The Rashi who says that the Mishkan was only given as an imperative after the Chet HaEgel, after the sin of the golden calf, as a concession and a way to offer Bnei Israel a chance, an opportunity for proper kapara, for proper atonement. Whereas the Ramban, much as he does with the sacrifices, says no, that the Mishkan was a lechatchila, ideal, always part of God's plan, and that it's a way to, and his understanding was that it was a way to perpetuate the revelation at Har Sinai and to always have access and the experience of God's closeness, as we did at Har Sinai and as we discussed last week in great detail. But that, if the Torah says and spends a lot of space and a lot of words, a lot of chapters and a lot of Shabbos mornings describing the Mishkan in every detail, it can't be that it was an afterthought, that it was not part of the original plan, but that there has to be some intrinsic intended value and message of the Mishkan from the get-go. And that's very much in line with what he says about the Korbanos as well, that, God wouldn't have spent so much time in detail telling us about these Korbanot if it was only meant as a stopgap to an easy ramp on to accommodate the improper idolatrous and religious thoughts of the people. There's a whole other discussion, which we kind of alluded to, about not only the medrash that can be applied in the context of a child who falls off the path, whatever the breaking point is for whoever, intermarriage, not keeping kosher, not keeping Shabbos, right? Do we reject and shun such a child, or do we try to embrace them and bring them back with a loving embrace? But more broadly, the Rambam's approach, I think, speaks very powerfully to what is a proper way of relating Torah and mitzvot to those Jews who might not be connected to it. And right, that if you can't find language and an approach that is in line and in sync with where people are at, then you won't have much luck in getting them where you want them to go. And so there's important kind of practical religious leadership implications to this debate as well. Not that the Ramban would disagree with that, but the Rambam, I think, spells it out a little bit more clearly in his approach. So anyway, that's enough of my rambling on this. We will end for tonight. Next week, is the week of Purim. So I'm thinking maybe we'll depart from the Parsha next week and do a little, not Purim Torah, but Torah related to Purim in a more serious way than we might be experiencing on Thursday of next week.
Great.
And we will, so we'll meet again next Tuesday to discuss some matters of Purim together.
Very good. Thank
Beautiful.
you.
Thank
All
you.
right. Have a
Thank
good night,
you for
everybody.
assembling all of this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank
My
you.
pleasure.